Have you ever felt like the world was moving all around you, full of noise and color and connection, while you stood perfectly still at the center of it all, invisible, untouched, as though you existed in a slightly different frequency than everyone else? If you have, then you already understand Lena Ashvale before she even opens her eyes on the first morning of her new life. And if you haven't, then stay with this story, because by the end of it, you will understand something profound about loneliness, about the wild places inside us that we never let anyone see, and about the kind of love that doesn't ask you to be smaller or quieter or more convenient, the kind of love that watches over you from the shadows long before it ever dares to speak your name. Before we go any further, if you are new here, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. We post new supernatural romance narratives every week, and this community has become something truly special. Now, settle in, because this story is going to take you somewhere deep and dark and breathtakingly beautiful. Lena was 22 years old when she buried the last person who had ever loved her without conditions. Her grandmother, Edith Ashvale, had been 81 years old and had lived every single one of those years, with a fierceness that made most people half her age feel tired just watching her. She had kept bees in the backyard of her small house in Vermont, had grown her own vegetables even in her final decade, had read 3 books a week until her eyes began to fail her in the last year of her life, and had loved Lena with a consistency and warmth that had been, for most of Lena's life, the only reliable thing in an otherwise unreliable world. Lena's parents had been young and restless, and ultimately more in love with the idea of freedom than with the reality of a child, and they had drifted out of her life in stages rather than all at once, which was somehow worse. Her father had left when she was 4, her mother when she was 7, and by the time she was 8 years old she had been living permanently with Edith in that small Vermont house, surrounded by the smell of beeswax and old books, and the particular kind of silence that feels like safety rather than absence. She had grown up loved in a quiet way, and she had been grateful for it every single day, even when she hadn't known how to say so. She had not made friends easily. There was something about her that other children sensed and kept their distance from, something that had never entirely gone away as she aged. She was not unfriendly. She was not unkind, but she was serious in a way that made casual people uncomfortable. And she felt things deeply in a way that frightened people who preferred to stay on the surface. She had gone to college and earned a degree in environmental science, had worked for 2 years at a research station, cataloging plant and animal species in northern forests, and had been quietly, persistently alone for nearly all of that time. Not unhappy, exactly, but alone. And then Edith had died on a Tuesday morning in late October, peacefully, in her own bed, with Lena sitting beside her holding her hand. And something in Lena's chest had gone very quiet in a way that frightened her. Not the grief itself, which was enormous and real and moved through her like weather, but the quiet that came after it, the sudden awareness that there was no longer anyone in the world who knew her the way Edith had known her, completely, without judgment, without the need for performance. She was, at 22, entirely and utterly alone in the world, and the weight of that knowledge was extraordinary. Edith had left her the cabin. Lena had not known about the cabin until the will was read by a kind-faced attorney in a wood-paneled office 3 days after the funeral. The cabin had apparently belonged to Edith's own grandmother, had passed down through the women of the family in a quiet, unofficial way, and was located in the mountains of northern West Virginia, deep in a stretch of old-growth forest that had, through some combination of luck and legal entanglement, never been developed or logged. The attorney had described it as remote, had used the word primitive once, with a slightly apologetic expression, and had pressed a hand-drawn map and a single old brass key into Lena's palm with the air of a man fulfilling a duty he didn't entirely understand. Lena had driven there 2 weeks after the funeral, on a gray November day, when the trees had lost most of their leaves, and the mountains rose in dark ridges against a sky the color of old pewter. The road had become a track, and the track had become barely more than 2 ruts in the earth before she had finally parked her old truck at the edge of a clearing and walked the last quarter mile through silent forest to find the cabin. Waiting. It was small and built of dark timber, weathered to the color of storm clouds, with a covered porch that ran the length of the front and windows that had somehow kept their glass through what must have been decades of disuse. There was a wood stove inside, a narrow iron bed with a mattress that needed replacing, shelves of old canning jars and older books, and a view through the back window of forest so dense and deep and dark that it seemed less like trees and more like a physical presence, a wall of living shadow that breathed and watched and waited. Lena had stood in the center of that small cabin for a very long time, and then she had made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She was going to stay. Not for a weekend, not for a month. She was going to stay, and she was going to fix the place up, and she was going to let the forest be the thing that held her for a while, because there was nothing else, and because the forest, at least, did not require her to be anything other than what she was. She had driven back out to the nearest town, a small place called Harrow, with a gas station and a general store, and a diner that smelled like coffee and fried potatoes, and had bought enough supplies to last several weeks. The man at the general store, who introduced himself as Mr. Grady and had the look of someone who had lived his entire life within a 20-mile radius and found this entirely satisfying, had helped her load her truck with a friendliness that felt genuinely kind. And then, as she was climbing into the cab, he had paused with his hand on the door and looked at her with an expression she would not fully understand until much later. "You're staying out at the Asheville place," he said. It was not a question. Word traveled fast in small places, and the news of Edith's death and the inheritance of the cabin had apparently already made its way to Harrow. Lena said yes, she was, and that she planned to stay for the foreseeable future. Mr. Grady had nodded slowly, in the way of a man choosing his words with unusual care, and had said, "The forest out that way is old. Real old. People around here don't go into it much." Lena had assumed he was about to warn her about bears or rough terrain, the kind of standard rural caution she had heard many times in her years of field research. But instead, he had said very quietly, "Just stay on the paths when you can, and if you feel like something is watching you, don't run." And then he had stepped back and closed her truck door and waved her off with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She had thought about that warning for the entire drive back. Had thought about it, and then, in the practical way of someone who had spent years alone in remote places, had filed it away under local superstition and focused on the more immediate concerns of getting the wood stove working and the mattress replaced before the temperature dropped. The first week was about settling. She drove into Harrow twice for supplies, brought a new mattress and several bags of firewood, fixed a leak in the roof with materials she found in a small shed behind the cabin, and spent long hours simply sitting on the porch in the cold, listening to the forest. It was remarkably silent out there, in the particular way of old forests where the ecosystem is so intact and so self-sufficient that it doesn't need to perform itself. No chainsaws in the distance, no traffic, no aircraft. Just wind, and the creak of enormous old trees, and occasionally the distant call of a bird she couldn't identify. She felt for the first time in a long time something that wasn't quite peace, but was adjacent to it. A kind of stillness, a sense that the world was very large and she was very small. And this was not a frightening thing, but simply a true thing. And truth was something she had always been able to bear better than most. She began exploring the forest on the 4th day, following the trails that started at the edge of the clearing and wound into the trees with the unhurried logic of paths made by deer and smaller animals over many years. She wore good boots and carried a small pack with water and a first aid kit and her field notebook, because old habits died hard, and she found herself cataloging as she walked, noting the species of trees, the presence of old stumps that suggested the forest's own history of disruption and regrowth, the fungi on fallen logs, the birds she could hear, but rarely see. On the 6th day, she had the first feeling. She was perhaps a mile from the cabin, following a trail that curved along the edge of a rocky outcropping above a narrow stream, when the hair on the back of her neck rose in the clean, unmistakable way that it only ever did when she was being watched. She stopped walking. She stood very still, the way Mr. Grady had advised, and listened. The forest had gone quiet in the particular way it does when something significant is present. When the small animals have taken note and fallen silent in deference to something larger. She turned slowly, scanning the trees, the dense undergrowth, the shadows between the trunks where the late afternoon light barely reached. She saw nothing, but the feeling did not go away, and when she began walking again, she was aware of it at her back for the entire mile home. That steady, unwavering sense of being observed by something patient and deliberate and very, very close. If you've ever been in a truly wild place, you know this feeling. And if you know it, you know that the fear it produces is not always the same as danger. Sometimes what you feel watching you from the forest is not threat. Sometimes it is simply attention, ancient and absolute. And the difference between those two things is everything. Please go ahead and drop a comment below telling me whether you would stay or leave, because I genuinely want to know. She told herself it was likely a bear, possibly a mountain lion, nothing she hadn't encountered in the course of her research work, and she resolved to make more noise on the trails going forward and to carry her emergency flare. She was not a foolish woman. But she was also, if she was honest with herself, not as frightened as she perhaps should have been, because underneath the practical response, underneath the scientist's habit of categorization and the field researcher's training in appropriate caution, there had been something else entirely. There had been, in that moment of stillness beside the rocky outcropping, a feeling she could not name and did not entirely trust, a feeling like recognition, like something out there in the dark knew her. And she, on some level that had nothing to do with reason, knew it back. She saw the eyes for the first time on the 8th night. She had gone to bed early, exhausted from a full day of clearing brush from around the cabin's foundation, and had woken at some hour between midnight and dawn to lie staring at the ceiling with the alert, wide-eyed wakefulness that follows deep sleep. The cabin was cold, despite the wood stove, and she lay listening to the silence. And then, for no reason she could identify, she turned her head toward the back window, the one that looked out on the forest. 2 points of gold light, absolutely still, absolutely steady, at the tree line. Too high for a deer. Too still for anything that wasn't watching with intent. She lay motionless, her heart beating in long, slow strokes, and looked at those golden eyes looking back at her, and the feeling she had was not terror. It was something that would take her a long time to find the right word for. And the word, when she finally found it, was witnessed. She watched the eyes for what might have been 3 minutes or 30, and then they blinked once, slowly, deliberately, and disappeared. She lay awake for a long time after, staring at the dark window, and when she finally slept, her dreams were full of warm shadow and the smell of earth after rain. Over the following 2 weeks, she established a kind of pattern, though she would not have called it that at the time. She worked on the cabin during the days, went out on the trails in the early afternoons, and in the evening she sat on the porch with a mug of tea and watched the tree line. And the tree line, with increasing frequency, watched back. She saw the golden eyes 3 more times, always at the edge of the forest, always in the hours around midnight. When she happened to wake, she began to suspect that it was always there when she was awake, and that the waking was not coincidence. She mentioned none of this to anyone, because there was no one to mention it to. She did go back to Harrow once, for supplies, and because she found herself wanting, faintly, the reassurance of other human voices. She had coffee at the diner, and ended up in a long conversation with the woman who worked the counter there, a woman named Betty, who was somewhere in her 60s, and had the forthright manner of someone who had long since decided that life was too short for indirection. When Lena mentioned that she had been seeing something at the tree line at night, golden eyes, very large, Betty had gone very still in a way that reminded Lena of the forest itself before the eyes appeared. Big Betty had said finally. Bigger than a regular cat? Lena had said yes, definitely, much bigger. Betty had refilled her coffee cup without being asked, and had said, in a low voice that was clearly not intended for the two old men playing checkers at the table by the window, "There are stories about that forest. Have been as long as anyone can remember. About something that lives in it. Something that's been there longer than the town, longer than any of us. Folks say it protects the forest, keeps it from being cut or built on, though I suppose some of that is lawyers." She had smiled briefly at her own joke, but they also say it's never hurt anyone. Whatever it is. She had looked at Lena with an expression of careful assessment. "You're not scared," she said. It wasn't quite a question. Lena had said no, not exactly, and Betty had nodded as though this confirmed something. "Good," she said. "That's probably the right answer." Lena had driven home through the mountains with the windows down despite the cold, feeling something she couldn't entirely name. The night the men came was the 19th night. She heard the trucks before she saw them, the grind of engines on the old track, and she was up and at the window before she was fully awake. 2 trucks, headlights cutting through the dark, stopping at the edge of the clearing. 4 men got out. She could see them clearly enough in the moonlight, and everything about their posture, and the way they moved, and the equipment she could see them unloading from the truck beds, told her they were not lost hikers or local hunters wandering off course. They moved with purpose. They moved like people who knew exactly where they were and why. She pulled on her boots and her jacket and looked around for options, which were limited. The cabin had 1 door and 3 windows. She had a phone with no signal, and an emergency flare and a wood axe she kept by the front porch. She was alone in a forest 20 miles from the nearest town. The men were between her and the only road. She heard them talking as they got closer to the cabin. 2 of them anyway, the others moving around the sides. The words she caught were not reassuring. Something about the land, something about a survey, something about a name she didn't recognize that sounded like a company name. And then one of them said her name, Lena Ashvale, and the way he said it made her understand that this was not a misunderstanding, and that she needed to be very afraid. She was backing toward the interior of the cabin when the front door shuddered under the impact of a heavy boot, and then the night outside turned into something that had no place in any taxonomy she knew. She heard it before she understood what she was hearing, a sound that was not a growl and not a scream, but something between the two. Something that vibrated at a frequency below thought and spoke directly to the oldest part of the human brain, the part that remembered, across every generation and every forgetting, that there were things in the dark that were so much older and larger and more powerful than human beings, that the appropriate response was not aggression, but immediate, absolute stillness. The sound stopped. Then she heard shouting, very brief, and then silence. And then nothing. For a long time. Nothing. She stayed where she was for what felt like an hour. She was not ashamed of this. When she finally moved to the window and looked out, the trucks were still there, their headlights on. But the men were gone. She could not see them anywhere in the clearing. And at the edge of the tree line, enormous and still against the darkness, something stood and looked back at her. Even across the distance, even in the moonlight, she could see the size of it. Black, so black, it seemed like a piece of the dark given shape and mass, with a quality of absolute stillness that made the trees around it look restless by comparison. And the eyes, golden, steady, burning like 2 held flames in the dark face. It stood and it looked at her, and she stood and she looked at it, and then very slowly it turned and walked into the forest and was gone. And she was alone in the clearing with 2 empty trucks and a racing heart, and the absolute certain knowledge that whatever had just happened had been, in some way, she did not yet have the language for, a declaration. She did not sleep the rest of that night. She sat by the wood stove with a blanket around her shoulders and her field notebook open in her lap and wrote down everything she had observed, in the precise, methodical way she had been trained to record data. Because this was what she did when she was frightened and needed to feel grounded. She wrote until the sky began to lighten outside the windows. And then she made coffee and sat on the porch in the cold gray dawn and waited. Though she couldn't have said what she was waiting for. She found out at noon. She heard footsteps on the track, single set, unhurried, and she was standing at the edge of the porch when the man came out of the trees. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that suggested not the deliberate cultivation of a gym, but the natural consequence of a body that had always been asked to do difficult things. He was dark-haired and pale-skinned, and he was walking with the careful, controlled gait of someone managing pain, his left arm held slightly away from his body in a way that suggested injury. He was wearing clothes that looked like they'd been put on in the dark. A dark flannel shirt not fully buttoned, and heavy canvas trousers and boots that were caked with forest mud. And, as he got closer, she could see the set of his jaw and the expression in his eyes, which were amber brown in the morning light, and held in them something old and careful and very tired. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at her without saying anything for a moment. There was a cut on his left jaw that had dried overnight, and a darkening bruise along his cheekbone, and his left hand, she now saw, was wrapped in a strip of what appeared to be torn fabric. "I'm sorry about last night," he said. His voice was low and even, with a quality of deliberate control that suggested it didn't always come out that steady. "You shouldn't have had to deal with that." Lena looked at him. She looked at the injury. She looked at his eyes. She thought about the empty truck still sitting at the edge of her clearing. She thought about the golden light burning in the darkness. "Are you hurt?" she said. He blinked. It seemed, briefly, like this was not the response he had been expecting. "Some," he said. "Not badly." "Come up on the porch," she said. "I have a first aid kit." There was a long pause. He looked at her with an expression she would later describe to herself as a man recalibrating, adjusting to a set of circumstances that had not gone according to any plan he had made. And then he came up the steps and sat in the second chair, the one that had always felt, she realized only at that moment, like it had been waiting for someone. And she went inside for the first aid kit. His name was Caleum Voss. He told her this while she cleaned the cut on his jaw with antiseptic, and he accepted the discomfort with a stillness that was not forced, but simply natural. The tolerance of someone for whom pain was not a new experience. He said he lived in the forest. And when she asked where exactly, he said further in, which she understood was all the answer she was going to get on that subject, at least for now. He said he had been aware of the men for several days and had been watching to make sure they didn't approach the cabin. When she asked why they had come, his jaw tightened slightly, and he said they worked for a development company that had been attempting, through various means legal and not, to acquire land in this part of the mountains for several years. The Ashvale property, being at the center of the old growth stretch they wanted, had been a particular focus. She wrapped his hand with fresh bandaging and sat back and looked at him and said, "You've, been watching the cabin?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation or apology. "For how long?" A pause. "Since you arrived. Were you watching before I arrived?" A longer pause. He looked at her steadily, with those amber eyes that caught the thin winter sunlight in a way that made them seem, for a moment, to hold their own light inside. "Yes," he said. She thought about that. She thought about the feeling at her back on the trail, the golden eyes at the window, the absolute specific quality of being known and attended to even in her most isolated moments. She thought about the empty trucks and the silence after the sound that had no name. "You should eat something," she said. "You look like you haven't eaten today." He ate the soup she heated and the bread she had baked 2 days before and drank 2 cups of coffee, and he watched her move around the small cabin kitchen with an attention that was not rude, but was absolutely comprehensive, the way an animal watches something it is trying to understand. She found she didn't mind it. She found, in fact, that being watched by him felt significantly different from any other kind of watching she had experienced, different from the evaluating glances of colleagues who were assessing her competence, different from the uncomfortable attention of strangers. This felt like being seen rather than scrutinized, like the attention itself was a kind of offering. He left in the early afternoon, saying he would come back, and she believed him with a certainty that had nothing to do with proof. Before we go on, I want to ask you something. Have you ever met someone and known in some part of you that works faster than thought that they were going to matter to you? Not wanted them to, not hoped they would, but simply known it, with the flat certainty of a fact? Leave me a comment below if this has ever happened to you. Because Lena knew, watching Caleum Voss walk back into the trees, that he was going to matter. She didn't understand yet. In what way? She couldn't have articulated the knowing, but it was there, clear and specific, and she didn't push it away. He came back the next day, and the day after, and within a week the visits had established themselves as a daily reality, with the naturalness of things that feel less like they are being built, and more like they are being uncovered. He came in the late mornings, stayed for several hours, and left before dark. He sat on the porch when the weather was bearable, and inside by the wood stove when it wasn't. And they talked, slowly at first, and then with increasing ease, about the forest and its ecology, about the species she had been cataloging in her notebook, about the history of the land and the old stories Betty had hinted at in the diner. He knew the forest the way she knew her own name, with an intimacy and specificity that went beyond learning, that felt instead like the knowledge of something that had been present in a place across a very long time. She noticed things about him in the careful, methodical way she noticed everything. She noticed that he seemed more comfortable outdoors than in, that he oriented automatically toward windows and open doors, that he sometimes paused in the middle of a sentence and tilted his head slightly, as though listening to something beyond the range of her hearing. She noticed that he had an extraordinarily precise awareness of the forest's mood, that he would look up suddenly before a wind came, or grow quiet, in a way that preceded the appearance of a hawk circling over the clearing. She noticed that the animals in the area were not afraid of him, that a deer had walked to within 10 feet of where they sat on the porch one afternoon without spooking, as though he was simply an extension of the landscape. And she noticed, because she was a scientist even when she was also a woman with a complicated and rapidly intensifying interest in a man, that he never came in the evenings, that he was always gone, well before dark, and that on the nights when she lay awake and looked out the back window, the golden eyes were always there, never at the same time, the man and the creature at the tree line, never overlapping, always alternating. She wrote this observation in her field notebook on the 14th day of his visits, and then sat looking at it for a long time, her pen still in her hand. She had grown up near forests, and had studied them formally, and had spent years in wild places, and she knew the literature of the natural world with unusual thoroughness. She knew the old stories, too, the ones that existed in every culture that had ever lived close to wilderness, the stories of threshold creatures, of beings that moved between the human and the wild, that wore the forest the way other things wore skin. She knew these stories and had never, before now, had a reason to test them against reality. She looked at what she had written in her notebook. Then she looked out the window at the forest. Then she closed the notebook and went to make more coffee, because the knowing was already there and it didn't need the proof, and what she was going to do with it was a different question entirely. What she did with it, first, was nothing. She continued as they had been. The daily visits, the hours on the porch, the slow and careful building of something that still didn't have a name. And she did not bring it up, and she watched him not bring it up either. And she thought about what it meant that he was carrying this particular weight, in the particular careful way he carried it, as though he was waiting for something, as though there was a question he needed her to ask first. She asked it on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after his first visit, on a morning when the first serious snow of the season had fallen overnight and turned the clearing and the forest into a study in black and white and gray. She had made breakfast for 2, which had also become a pattern, and they had eaten in a silence that was warm rather than empty, and she had cleared the plates and refilled their coffee cups, and then sat down across from him and looked at him directly. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to tell me the truth." His hands, wrapped around his coffee cup, were very still. His eyes met hers without evasion. "I will," he said. "The Panther," she said. "Is it you?" The cabin was very quiet. Outside, snow was beginning again, fine and soft, falling straight down in the absence of wind. He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression that moved through several things too quickly to name, before settling into something that was, she thought, something close to relief. "Yes," he said. She had known. She had known. And yet, hearing it said aloud, produced a kind of physical response, a pressure in her chest that was not fear and not surprise, but was the specific feeling of a reality shifting into a new configuration, of the world becoming, in some permanent way, larger. She took a breath and let it out. "Okay," she said. He looked at her with an expression she would carry with her for a long time after that morning, a look of such naked astonishment and vulnerability that she felt it like a hand around her heart. "Okay," he said. "I'm not afraid of you," she said. "I've never been afraid of you. I think you know that." "I know," he said very quietly. "That's the thing that has surprised me most." She asked him questions. Then, because she was, and the questions were necessary. And he seemed to understand this, seemed even to want it, the chance to be known accurately rather than imagined. He was, he told her, what the old literature called a shifter, and specifically a Black Panther shifter, though the clinical term flattened something that was far more layered and strange and beautiful than any clinical term could contain. He had been in this forest for a very long time. Not all his life, but close to it. He had come here, young, and the forest had claimed him in the specific way that wild places claim the people who are genuinely meant for them. And he had stayed. He told her about his kind, the small, scattered population of shifters who existed in wild places across the world, who were not, as the stories often made them out to be, a community, or a pack, or an organization, but simply individuals connected by nature and separated by geography, and largely concerned with the same thing he was concerned with, which was the protection of the wild places they called home. He told her about the development company, about the years of attempts to acquire the forest land, about the legal maneuvering and the bribery, and, more recently, the decision to move to methods less concerned with legality. He told her about the old-growth forest and what it represented ecologically and what it would mean to lose it. He did not, yet, tell her everything. She could feel the things he was not saying the way you feel a room that has furniture in it even in the dark, the sense of shapes waiting to be named. But she did not push. She understood, from long experience with her own need for careful disclosure, that some truths needed to be approached obliquely and from a distance before they could be said plainly. And she had time. She was beginning to understand, something that felt like it might be a great deal of time. "Why did you come to my door?" she asked. "After that night, you could have stayed hidden. I might never have known." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the snow was falling more heavily now, and the forest had gone white and still and dreamlike behind the window. "I had been watching you for 3 weeks," he said finally. "I had watched you arrive and unpack and fix the roof and walk the trails and sit on the porch in the cold, talking to no one and writing in your notebook. I had watched you and I had thought." He stopped. He looked down at his hands and then back up at her, and the thing in his eyes was something she had not seen in anyone's eyes before, a combination of certainty and fear that felt very old and very honest. "I had thought that if I didn't at least try to speak to you, I would regret it, and I have very few regrets about the choices I've made. I didn't want another one." She looked at him across the table with its cleared plates and 2 coffee cups, steaming in the winter cold that crept under the cabin door, and she thought about choices and regrets and the specific courage it took to walk out of the dark toward something you wanted, when you had spent a very long time believing that wanting was not available to you. "I'm glad you did," she said. "The subscription reminder might feel interrupting right now, but this is the part of the story where I need to ask you, if this story is moving you, if you feel something for these 2 people sitting across from each other in a snowbound cabin with the truth finally named between them, to share it with someone. Because stories like this one, about the loneliness and the long waiting, And the moment when someone finally walks out of the forest toward you, they deserve to travel. The weeks that followed the snow were the quietest of Lena's life, and also, paradoxically, the fullest. Caleum began staying later, past dark, once and then twice, and then consistently. And she understood this as what it was, a choice to let the two parts of himself exist in the same space, to be the man. With her without hiding the thing that lived alongside the man. He did not shift in her presence. Not yet, not for some time still, but he stopped pretending that the night held nothing of him. And she stopped pretending that she hadn't known, and the pretending they let go of made room for something true, and tentative, and extraordinarily careful. They talked for hours, about everything and gradually, about everything that mattered. She told him about Edith, about growing up with the specific texture of loved but isolated, about the way the years since childhood had confirmed a pattern she hadn't chosen, but had learned to live inside of. She told him about the research work and the 2 years at the remote station, and the way she had felt most herself when she was in the field, alone but attentive, part of something larger than her own circumstances. He listened with the absolute quality of attention she had noticed in the earliest days, the attention that felt like something being given rather than something taken. He told her about what it was to be what he was, about the shifting itself, the way it felt from the inside, not like becoming something else, but like becoming more completely what he already was, the way certain music makes you feel more entirely yourself, rather than transported out of yourself. He told her about the loneliness of it, and he said the word without flinching, and she loved him for that, for the willingness to name it, because loneliness was the thing that most people of experience preferred to talk around. He had been alone in this forest for a very long time, he said. Not unhappy, but alone. Like me, she said. Like you, he said, and the two words sat between them with the weight of a recognition that went back further than that winter, and further back, possibly, than either of them could fully account for. She thought about the cabin that had been waiting, passed down through the women of her family in a quiet, unofficial chain. She thought about her grandmother's eyes, which had been amber-brown in a particular morning light that she had always loved. She thought about the hand-drawn map and the single brass key pressed into her palm, and the attorney who had seemed to be fulfilling a duty he didn't entirely understand. She thought about the word inevitable, and whether it was a comfortable word or an uncomfortable one, and decided, sitting next to Caleum Voss in the firelight, with the snow still falling outside, that it was simply a true one. The first time he took her hand, it was not romantic, exactly, in the way that word is usually meant. They were sitting on the porch on a night in January that was clear and cold enough to make the stars extraordinary, and she had made a joke about something she could no longer remember, and he had laughed, genuinely, fully. The way she was learning was not easy for him, the way that his laughter, when it came, was something given rather than performed, and in the middle of... And he had reached across and taken her hand where it rested on the arm of her chair and held it, and neither of them had said anything about it or needed to. His hand was warm. That was the thing she noticed, and kept noticing. He ran warmer than she did, warmer than she would have expected. And she thought about the black coat she had seen at the tree line and the warmth that had to be inside it, and she held his hand back and looked at the stars. What followed was slow in the way that growing things are slow, inevitable and seasonal, and worth the patience. There were evenings by the fire and mornings in the kitchen, and whole afternoons walking the trails, side by side, while she catalogued and he watched, and both of them existed, fully and without performance, in a shared space that felt like the most honest thing either of them had ever been inside of. There was the first time he kissed her, which happened on an evening in late January after they had been talking for 3 hours and had arrived, gradually and together, at a silence so charged and so clear that the move from that silence to his mouth against hers felt less like a decision and more like a conclusion, the natural resolution of something that had been working itself out since before either of them had the courage to look at it directly. She pulled back after a moment and looked at him in the firelight and put her hand against his face, against the jaw where the cut had long since healed, and he closed. his eyes briefly under her hand in the way of someone absorbing something they had not known how to hope for. And she thought, in a quiet and certain part of herself, yes. Simply that. Yes. But the forest was not finished with them yet, and neither was the development company, and the world had a way of insisting on its own timeline, regardless of what the people inside it preferred. She found out about the second survey team in mid-February, not from Caleum, who was away from the cabin for 2 days in a way that was becoming less unusual as winter deepened and the demands of the forest on its guardian increased, but from Betty, who called the cabin's landline, which Lena had discovered worked, if not reliably, with a warning that felt urgent. The company, Betty said, had hired a new surveying team, and the word in town was that this time they had also hired protection, which was the word Betty used, and which both of them understood to mean something other than security guards. When Caleum returned, he found her with her field notebook open on the kitchen table, making notes in the methodical way she defaulted to under stress, and the expression on her face must have told him something, because he sat down across from her without asking and waited. "Tell me everything," she said. "About the company, about the land, about whatever it is you've been not quite telling me since October." He told her everything. The land, he said, had been at the center of a legal battle for more than 40 years, ever since a large mineral survey in the 1970s had revealed what lay beneath the old-growth forest. Not minerals in the conventional sense, but something stranger and rarer, a geological formation that was producing, from fractures in the rock deep underground, a substance that the company's scientific consultants had been trying for years to characterize, and that defied, by all accounts, characterization. It produced effects on the ecosystem above it, on the animals in the forest, on certain people who spent enough time in the land's presence. The company wanted it not for development in the usual sense, but for study, for extraction, for the application of whatever it was to purposes that had, over the 40 years of the company's pursuit, shifted from scientific to something considerably less legible. The Ashvale family had known about it. His voice was very careful as he said this. Edith had known about it. The cabin and the land around it were not simply a family property, but a specific kind of watch point, occupied across generations by women of the Ashvale line who had a particular relationship with the land and with what lay beneath it, and who had been, across those generations, part of the reason the forest had remained intact. Not the only reason, but part of it. Lena thought about her grandmother. She thought about the key and the map and the attorney's expression and Betty's words about something that had been in the forest longer than the town. She thought about the feeling she had had from the very first day, the feeling of recognition, of having arrived somewhere she had always been going. "How long have you known?" she asked. "That you were coming?" "Since midsummer." "How?" He looked at her steadily. "The forest knows," he said, which was not an answer that would have satisfied her 6 months earlier, and which satisfied her now completely, because she had spent enough time in the forest to understand that this was not mysticism, but something closer to ecology, the vast and intricate information network of a living system that processed and responded to what was coming toward it with an accuracy that human instrumentation could not match. "What do they want?" she asked. "The company. What exactly do they want from the land?" "Control," he said. "What they've always wanted. Over something that cannot be controlled, that isn't meant to be controlled, that will not survive being controlled." His voice, which was almost always level, had something in it now that was not quite anger, but was what lives alongside anger in people who have been watching something they love be threatened for a very long time. The thing below this forest is alive, not in the way you and I are alive, but in the way the forest is alive, as a system, as a network. It's been here longer than the mountains above it, and if they get their hands on it, they will study it and test it and break it trying to understand it, and when they've broken it, the forest above it will die, and everything in it. He stopped. He looked at his hands. "Everything in it," he said again, quietly. She understood now why he had been in this forest for a very long time. She understood now what watching over something really meant when the something was also you. When the land and the creature in it had been shaped by the same deep source until the distinction between guardian and guarded was no longer meaningful. We need to go to the records. Office, she said. He looked at her. The land records, she said. The mineral rights documentation, the survey filings. There will be inconsistencies. There always are in situations like this. Corners cut, filings that don't match, permits that were issued without proper basis. I've seen this before with extraction cases, in a different context. But the legal mechanics are the same. She was talking quickly now, in the focused way she talked when she was thinking through a problem, and she could see him watching her with an expression that was new on his face, a quality of attention that was different from the attentiveness she knew, sharper and more awake. If there are grounds for a title challenge, or better yet, a conservation easement challenge, we can tie this up in litigation for years, long enough to get an independent environmental assessment of the formation, long enough to establish protected status for the forest, long enough that by the time they get through the legal process, whatever extraction equipment they're planning to bring in will be obsolete. She paused. I know an environmental attorney. She owes me a favor, a significant one. Caleum looked at her for a long moment. You've thought about this before, he said. I've been thinking about it for weeks, she said. I just didn't have all the information I needed. Something moved across his face that she would think about for a long time. A complicated brightness that was something between admiration and incredulity, and something she didn't have a name for yet, that she would eventually come to understand as the specific feeling of being met. Okay, he said, and the way he said it echoed something back to her from a morning in November. A single word that carried more weight than the single word contained. If you are finding this story as compelling as I hope you are, this would be a wonderful moment to subscribe if you haven't already, because what comes next is going to change everything. For Lena, for Caleum, and for the ancient living thing that had been waiting beneath those mountains for longer than either of them could imagine. The next 6 weeks were the most intense of Lena's life, and she would later reflect, genuinely not known what her life was capable of being until those weeks. She called her environmental attorney contact, a woman named Dr. Priya Mehta, who had the manner of someone who found legal combat energizing rather than exhausting, and spent 3 hours on the phone explaining the situation in enough detail that Priya's initial skepticism had shifted, by the end of the call, to something that sounded distinctly like appetite. She drove to the county records office and spent 2 full days going through land filing records, emerging at the end of the second day with a stack of photocopies and a list of 7 specific inconsistencies in the company's mineral rights documentation that Priya confirmed, upon review, were, in her exact words, a gift. She also wrote, she had, in her field notebook, accumulated 4 months of careful, methodical observation about the forest's ecology, the flora and fauna she had catalogued, the readings she had taken with the simple instruments she had brought, and the more sophisticated ones she had subsequently ordered, the ways in which the ecosystem of this particular old-growth stretch exceeded in complexity and diversity, what she would have predicted even for a forest of this age and quality. She organized this into a formal research summary and sent it to 3 colleagues from her graduate program who were now at institutions with the resources and credibility to support what she was suggesting, which was that this forest warranted urgent formal ecological study, and that any development activity in or near it should be halted pending that study. 2 of the 3 colleagues responded within 48 hours. Both responses were versions of yes. She did all of this at the kitchen table, in the cabin, by lantern light and wood stove warmth, with Caleum across from her reading the land documents she brought home, or simply present in the particular way he had of being present, which was not passive but attentive, a steady and grounding force that allowed her to work better and longer and with more precision than she was accustomed to working. She did not think about this too hard at the time, the way his presence improved her concentration rather than disrupting it. But she would think about it later, and it would seem to her a meaningful piece of evidence about the specific kind of partnership they were building. The company sent a 3rd team in March, this time with what were clearly legal representatives as well as the surveyors, and this time Lena was ready for them. She met them at the edge of the property line in her boots and her worn canvas jacket, with a copy of the emergency injunction that Priya had filed the previous week and had served to the company's registered agents the day before, and she handed it to the lead lawyer with a pleasantness that she had learned, over the past months, was considerably more unsettling than aggression. The lawyer read the document, and his expression went through several stages before arriving at controlled frustration. "This isn't over," he said. "No," she agreed. "But for right now, today, you need to leave." They left. She watched them go, and when she turned around, Caleum was standing at the tree line, leaning against a large oak, watching her with an expression that she had come to know well. That specific brightness in his eyes that meant he was feeling something he had not yet found the words for. And she walked across the clearing toward him, and he straightened, and she walked directly into his arms, and he held her there in the cold March morning with his chin resting on her hair, and the forest all around them, quiet and immense and alive. "You've been practicing that," he said after a moment. "The pleasantness?" she said into his shoulder. "Yes. Betty helped," she said. She felt his chest move with something that was, unmistakably, laughter. The legal process was not fast and it was not simple, and there were, in the months that followed, setbacks and complications, and at least 2 moments when the outcome seemed genuinely uncertain. But Priya was formidable, and the research summary had gained traction in the environmental science community with a speed that even Lena's most optimistic scenarios had not quite predicted. And by the time the case reached its first major hearing in early summer, the forest had more legal protection around it than at any point in the previous 40 years. And something else was happening. In the weeks since the emergency injunction, when the immediate pressure of the company's advances had eased even partially, something had changed in the forest. She noticed it in small ways at first: the quality of light in the mornings, a new, particular kind of quiet that was different from ordinary quiet. A sense of something attended to, something that had been braced for impact for a very long time, that was very cautiously beginning to let itself rest. She noticed it in the ecology, too, in the way the spring growth came in fuller and more varied than she had recorded it in her first winter months, in the return of species she had noted as present but sparse, and she noticed it in Caleum, in the way the tiredness that lived in the lines around his eyes had begun, incrementally, to lift, in the way he laughed more easily, in the way he seemed, in small daily ways, to be setting down something he had carried for so long, he had forgotten what it weighed. She noticed it in herself too, the quiet in her chest that had followed Edith's death, the specific absence that she had carried through those first months in the cabin, was not gone, because grief doesn't go, but it had changed shape, had become something she could live alongside rather than inside of, had integrated into the texture of a life that was, for the first time in a long time, full in the way that mattered. He shifted in her presence for the first time on a night in late April, and it happened with the simplicity and the naturalness of something that had been waiting for the right conditions rather than being decided. They were outside, in the clearing, on one of the nights that had become a habit, sitting in the grass looking at the sky, talking, intermittently in the easy way of people who have long since made friends with each other's silences. And at some point the talking had stopped, and the silence had gone on, warm and open, and she had become aware, in her peripheral vision, of a shift in the quality of his stillness, a deepening of it, a change in the kind of presence beside her. She turned her head. He was no longer there. Beside her, enormous and black, and utterly still against the spring grass, the panther lay stretched out, watching the stars with golden eyes, and the sense she had of him in that form was, she thought, the most accurate thing she had ever felt. He was the same, entirely the same, just as she had always thought, just more completely himself, more purely whatever it was that he was. And the love she had been carrying quietly for months moved through her like a clean and simple current, and she reached out her hand and placed it between the great cat's shoulder blades, feeling the warmth of the black coat under her palm, and he leaned into her hand with a slowness and a care that was, in that form as in his other, entirely, unmistakably him. They stayed like that for a very long time, under the April stars, with the forest breathing around them and the ancient living thing far below them, doing whatever ancient living things do. In the dark and the patience and the long continuation, she told Betty about it. Betty's response was a very long silence followed by the kind of nod that indicated she was confirming information she had already suspected rather than receiving a surprise. That would explain the eyes, Betty said. It would, Lena agreed. You're happy, Betty said. This was also not quite a question. I am, Lena said, and found that the simplicity of the answer was exactly right. Before we reach the ending of this story, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something about what Lena and Caleum built together in that forest. It was not a perfect thing or an easy thing, and there were aspects of his nature and her choices, and the situation they were both embedded in, that created challenges that simple love does not automatically resolve. He was not entirely human. And what this meant in practice was something they had to figure out together, with patience and honesty and the kind of steady, unglamorous commitment that doesn't make for dramatic stories, but makes for real ones. She was not a woman who required rescue, and he was not a man who offered it. And the partnership they built was built on the basis of each of them being, fully and without reduction, what they actually were. This matters. I think this is actually the point, the thing this story is really about, underneath the forest and the golden eyes and the legal battles and the ancient geological formations. It is about the specific and rare and deeply worth waiting for experience of being in the presence of someone who does not need you to be smaller in order for them to feel large, of having your wholeness, your strangeness, your difficult, complete self, not merely tolerated but recognized and wanted. Lena had spent 22 years being, in most of the spaces she inhabited, too much of some things and not enough of others. And what Caleum had seen in her from the tree line, the thing that had brought him out of the forest and up those porch steps, was not despite those qualities, but because of them. And she had seen in him something that other people, confronted with the same set of facts, might have found frightening, and had found instead not comfort exactly, but something truer, something that felt like recognition, like the world was a larger and stranger and more generous place than she had been able to let herself believe, and that she was, finally, in a large enough space to be entirely and without apology herself. The injunction became permanent in August. The conservation easement, pushed through with a combination of Priya's legal skill and the growing weight of academic interest in Lena's research, was finalized in September. The development company, faced with the compounded effect of the legal obstacles and the public attention that the academic papers were beginning to generate, withdrew their acquisition efforts entirely in October, exactly 1 year after Lena had arrived in the mountains. She marked the anniversary by baking a honey cake, using Edith's recipe from a handwritten card she had found in the back of one of the cabins. Old cookbooks, and they ate it on the porch in the October cold with coffee, and the particular satisfaction of people who have fought for something and won, who know that winning is not the ending, but is a new and better kind of beginning. He gave her something on that evening. He produced it from his jacket pocket with the slightly awkward deliberateness of a man who does not give gifts often, and is therefore uncertain of the gesture itself. A small piece of dark stone, shot through with veins, of deep amber, the color of his eyes, smooth and warm in her palm. From the formation, he said, from the edge of it, where I can reach. She held it in her hand and felt the warmth of it, a warmth that was not body heat, that was something older and more specific than that, and she thought about the living thing below the mountains and the forest above it, and the cabin passed down through the women of her family and the grandmother who had known, and had passed the key into her palm at exactly the right moment. And she thought that the word inevitable was not, after all, a limitation. It was a door. She closed her hand around the stone and looked at Caleum in the October light. his amber eyes and his careful face, and the way the forest behind him seemed, as it always had, to lean slightly toward him, belonging to him and he to it, and she thought about what she had told Betty, "I am," and found that it was still entirely, simply true. "I'm staying," she said, meaning forever, meaning the forest and the work and the cabin and him, meaning all of it, the whole difficult and extraordinary thing. He looked at her with those eyes that caught the light and held it. "I know," he said, and the forest was quiet around them, and the stone was warm in her hand, and the stars were beginning in the darkening sky above the mountains, and the ancient living thing far below turned in its slow dreaming, and knew that what it had been holding was safe. Epilogue. 2 years later, the paper Lena, published in March on the geological formation beneath the old-growth forest in the West Virginia mountains, generated more academic interest than anything she had written before or would write for some time after. And this was not only because of the rigorous ecological data she had gathered over 2 years of careful fieldwork, or the collaboration with the 4 colleagues whose institutional resources had made the formal study possible, but because of the central argument she made in the paper's conclusion, that the formation appeared to function as a kind of deep planetary memory, an ancient information storage system of biological origin that was more complex and more alive than anything previously characterized in the scientific literature, and that its preservation was not merely an environmental concern, but a matter of what she carefully and precisely called civilizational significance. The paper was cited 43 times in the first year after publication. She had her own office now, in the building that had been, a year and a half ago, just a plan on paper. The field research station that the university partnership had finally funded and built at the edge of the town of Harrow, where Betty had attended the opening celebration and declared the whole thing well past due. Lena walked from the cabin to the station 3 days a week, when the weather allowed, and drove on the others, and the familiar figure of Caleum Voss was often seen in the station's common room in the late mornings, drinking coffee with the air of a man who found the comings and goings of academic researchers intermittently baffling and consistently interesting. He had started talking to the researchers who came to study the forest. Not all of them, and not at first, but gradually and selectively, with the same quality of care he brought to everything. There was one graduate student from the ecology program who had written what everyone agreed was an unusually sensitive thesis section on the relationship between large predator presence and old-growth ecosystem health, and who had gone very still when she read the acknowledgments page of Lena's paper, where she had written, with the precision of someone choosing every word very deliberately, to CV, whose knowledge of this forest is the most accurate and complete I have ever encountered, and whose patience with my questions has been inexhaustible. The forest is luckier than it knows to have you. The graduate student had looked up from the paper and across the common room to where Caleum sat, and he had met her eyes with the level, amber gaze that Lena had learned to read as a specific kind of invitation, and the graduate student had closed the paper and walked over with her coffee and asked her first careful question, and he had answered it. In the clearing behind the cabin, on the first warm evening of the spring after the 2nd anniversary of Lena's arrival, they sat in the grass again, as they had on so many evenings under the early stars, and the forest was the same as it had always been and was also, in the specific way of living things that are given the conditions they need, more entirely and confidently itself than it had been before. The stone was in her jacket pocket, warm against her ribs. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he turned his head and rested his cheek against her hair, and neither of them spoke for a long time, because everything that needed saying had been said, and some of the most important things couldn't be said at all, could only be felt in the warmth of the body beside you, and the quiet of the forest around you, and the deep and living dark below, holding everything. "Stay," he said, very softly after a while, though he already knew the answer. He said it the way people say the things they most need to hear confirmed, not out of doubt, but out of love for the confirmation itself, for the real and spoken truth of the thing they have been given. She took his hand. "Always," she said. "And that, I think, is exactly where we leave them. Not at the end of the story, because this is one of those stories that doesn't end, that simply continues past the edge of what we can see into a future that is still being written, but at a moment of such complete and quiet rightness that it contains everything, the loneliness that preceded it, and the courage that made it possible, and the love that grew in a forest that people said was empty and turned out, as forests always do, to be absolutely full. If this story moved you, if you found something true in it about waiting and being seen and the world being stranger and more generous than you had allowed yourself to believe, please leave me a comment below. Tell me what you took from it. Tell me about the forest in your own life, the places where something watches over you from the shadows, patient and golden-eyed and waiting for you to be ready. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, this is the moment. We have more stories like this one, more forests and guardians and lonely women who turn out to be exactly what the ancient things have been watching for. Subscribe, share this story with someone who needs it, and we will see you in the next one. The forest is not empty. It never was. It